This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israeli generals call on President Biden not to sign the Iranian nuclear deal and keep a viable military option open. And a new museum of the Jewish people tells their story like never before. Plus, Ukrainian orphans sheltering in Israel move forward here, given the uncertainty back home. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Julie Stahl. Israel is maintaining a pressure campaign urging President Biden not to sign the Iranian nuclear deal. The latest effort includes a plea from thousands who spent their careers protecting Israel. This letter, signed by dozens of former Israeli generals to President Biden, represents 5,000 representatives across Israel's military, security, and law enforcement agencies.
He published a letter calling President Biden not to sign the agreement with Iran. We think that this agreement is a huge threat to Israel, to the Middle East, to the whole world. And it basically paves the way legally for the Iranians to become a nuclear power in the end of the agreement in 2031.
According to Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid's office, he spoke directly to President Biden about their shared commitment to stopping Iran's progress towards a nuclear weapon. The statement added that President Biden emphasized his deep commitment to preserving Israel's capability to deter its enemies and to defend itself by itself against any threat.
We're talking about a future existential threat to Israel. This is just kicking the can along the road.
Reserve Brigadier General Amir Avivi, founder of the Israel Defense and Security Forum, says a signed agreement would lead to major issues worldwide.
If the Middle East is destabilized, the price of oil will go up. The world chain of supply will be affected. And terrorism will be everywhere.
After a briefing from Lapid, former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke directly to Iran's leadership.
I want to send a very clear message to the Ayatollahs in Iran. With an agreement or without an agreement, they will never get a nuclear weapon.
Supporters of re-entering the deal, like Biden, believe the original 2015 accord effectively restrained Iran's nuclear capabilities, although military intelligence reports and UN inspectors have refuted that conclusion.
For us, this deal doesn't make sense. It's very, very dangerous, and we call upon the President of the United States to stop this deal and go back to sanctions and a viable military option.
The White House confirmed that during the conversation with Lapid, President Biden underscored U.S. commitment to never allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. Iranians have few sources of information they can trust in their own Farsi language. Now, a new program from CBN, broadcast to those inside the regime, aims to help fill the gap. Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell asks show producer Myra Yazdari about the program and the situation inside her native land.
Myra Yazdari, great to be with you on Jerusalem Dateline. And, we do so many stories on Iran and the Iranian people. And I was so glad to hear what you're doing with Christian World News in Farsi. Tell us about it. It's just about 3 months old, is that right?
Yes, that's true. Well, thank you so much for having me. As you might know, Iranians inside the country, there's no independent media from the government. So newspapers, television, the state TV, they all propagate the regime's agenda. What you might not know is about networks and televisions outside of the country, the Farsi-speaking ones, that Iranians don't trust them either. Why? Is regime has, throughout the years, has kind of forced their people
around the world in different places?
Yes, who were former political prisoners and activists and journalists that after they was released and left the country and they are in free world, you don't expect them to support the regime or the government.
Right.
But those are actually sent by the regime. And that's how they could maintain this idea of so-called reformist wing of the regime that kept the people busy with this. If you vote this time, you know, this president will bring change, they will create reform. And that's how this idea of reformists lasted for over 20 years. They helped the regime, the entire system to last. So long story short, we sensed the lack of, the absence of a source that people can trust.
Yeah.
And that's how we decided to start Christian World News, to not only, you know, provide this trustable source for people, but also bring this Christian perspective for Christians inside Iran who are under persecution. They can see what is going around the world by other Christians.
I think that's some of the untold story about Iran, persecution of Christians, and also how many people inside Iran don't like the regime. They're not supportive of the regime. In fact, I would say the majority of people are opposed to the regime. Would that be a fair assessment of what's going on in Iran right now?
It's not just the Christians, it's all religious minorities.
Right.
Even though Muslims who do not support what the regime believes in, you know, what they do to Baha'is, you know, what they do to, you know, all minorities. So, of course, they don't support the regime.
Yeah.
I know many Christians that left the country, including myself, but many Christians are still in the country, underground churches that, well, we don't have an exact number, but we know that it's the first growing underground church around the world is in Iran.
It's a very young show, but have you had any response from people that have seen it?
Yes, from my audience that they've been watching. It is still new. It is, you know, reaching out its audiences. But as I told you, people are really fed up by medias that have ties with the regime.
Sure.
So they watch you, they follow till they can, you know, differentiate. Is your program also is experts that you bring on the show to talk about topics. If they don't find those ties with the government, they would be happy.
Yeah. And how can people watch Christian World News in Farsi?
Right now is on Muhabbat TV on Fridays, Iran 6:30 p.m. And also on Facebook, CWN Farsi.
Okay.
That's how they can find it on Facebook.
Well, Myra Yazdari, great to be with you, and much success in your new show, and thanks for being with us on Jerusalem Dateline.
Thanks so much, my pleasure.
Coming up, a new museum telling the story of the Jewish people like never before. When God wanted to tell the story of his faithfulness through the ages, he chose to do it through the Jewish people. Now that history is the subject of a new museum in Israel. Anu, it means us. That's the name of the new Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv. Its goal? Tell the story of God's chosen people from Abraham until today.
It's the biggest museum of its kind in the world. So whereas there are literally hundreds of Jewish museums all over the world, this is the only one that attempts to tell the whole story.
The museum combines artifacts, stories, artwork, and innovative technologies to tell the good and sometimes difficult history of the Jewish people like never before. CEO Dan Tadmore believes this story is relevant to both Jews and non-Jews.
We refer to Judeo-Christian values as the bedrock of Western society. They are Judeo-Christian values. It's the things that we share. It's the values of the Bible.
The museum covers 72,000 square feet of exhibition space spread over 3 floors. One aspect features interactives.
So does your name come from the Bible? So let's punch in Jonathan. Here we go. And you will be happy to learn that Jonathan struck down the Philistine prefect in Geba. And the Philistines heard about it. Saul had the ram's horn sounded throughout the land.
And this one shows how to make ethnic Jewish foods from around the world. I think I'm going to go for the stuffed leaves.
Okay, let's go. So you get your list of ingredients, but now you actually need to work.
Uh-oh, okay.
You begin by putting the rice in the bowl. So drag the rice into the bowl.
Oh, okay. Add the ground meat.
Add the ground beef. Great. Now you're gonna have to grate the onion. So grate the onion, go back and forth on the grater. So this is fun, but it's also, you come away with a recipe.
More than 50 original films help tell the various parts of the story.
We're now on the historical wing, and this wing is a chronological track that begins with Abraham and ends with the establishment of the State of Israel and beyond. It's a 7-minute huge projection that tells the entire story of Jewish migrations through the ages.
The path begins with the 6th century BC exile of the Jewish people to Babylon.
Until then, all Jews resided in one place. So for 2,000 years and the present, Jews always live in diverse places.
And proceeds to include the first believers in Jesus.
And of course, the first Christians considered themselves Jews because they were. And so this is that part of history. This diorama tells the story of the competition between this newly founded religion, the cross, in front of a synagogue.
Visitors can learn about the Inquisition, how Jews in Spain were forced to convert to Christianity. Even though the dark chapters in Jewish history like the Holocaust are part of the story, Tadmor says the museum is about Jewish life.
When we look at Jewish history and Jewish life, we refuse to do so solely from the position of the victim. Jews have not only been persecuted and survived. Along the way, we've thrived and flourished.
The first Jews in North America established the first synagogue there in Newport, Rhode Island.
This is a replica of a letter written by George Washington to the Jewish community of Newport, in which he basically says the children of Abraham will always have a home in these United States.
Tadmor's favorite item is here in what they call the Hallelujah Hall, dedicated to synagogues around the world throughout the ages. Most of the congregations represented are still in use. This was one of the biggest synagogues in Warsaw, Poland. Blown up by the Nazis, the leadership hid the holy items before the Nazis arrived and then secretly sold them to feed the Jews in the ghetto.
So this is the actual object from a synagogue that was destroyed by the Nazis over 70 years ago. And it miraculously survived because a Swedish philanthropist acquired it. It somehow made its way to Stockholm, probably because you were able to dismantle it and send it, and it has survived. The synagogue didn't, the congregants of the synagogue didn't, but the menorah did. And so you asked me about my favorite object.
Tadmor says the museum is so big you can't see it all in one day, but that only encourages people to return again and again to interact with the never-ending story of the Jewish people. Julie Stahl, CBN News, the Museum of the Jewish People, Tel Aviv. Up next, Mikhail Gorbachev's legacy, setting one Jewish captive free and opening the Jewish immigration floodgates to Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid hailed former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev as a brave leader. Gorbachev died at 91 on August 30th. Lapid also credited Gorbachev with opening the gates of the Soviet Union to allow a great wave of Jewish immigration in the 90s. One of the first prisoners Gorbachev freed was former refusenik Natan Sharansky. His release in 1986 paved the way for the immigration of some 2 million former Soviet Jews to Israel. Here's an earlier story CBN's Scott Ross did about Sharansky.
Natan Sharansky has been connecting Jewish people to Israel for 50 years. There was a time, however, he didn't see anything good about his heritage.
I was born in 1948 in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine. We had nothing Jewish in our life. We were absolutely assimilated. No Jewish institutions existed, no Jewish culture, no synagogue. But there was one very Jewish thing in our life, and it was anti-Semitism. There was nothing positive in my being Jewish. There was only negative.
That changed in 1967 when Israel defeated the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the Six-Day War, reuniting Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty.
Here, Israel emerges victorious after the attempt of Arab countries to destroy it. And the Soviet Union made a lot of efforts to destroy Israel.
Would the Soviet Union allow you to emigrate?
It was impossible. It was the regime who already killed tens of millions of citizens. So they would have no problem to kill another few hundred Jews, but we were lucky. Our struggle from the very first day became the struggle of all the Jews in the world, and with the time also of many non-Jews. And they succeeded to link all the interests of Soviet Union with the fate of Soviet Jews.
As an advocate for human rights and the Zionist movement, Sharansky also became known as a refusenik, a Jew who was refused permission to leave the Soviet Union and immigrate to Israel.
When they arrested me finally after a few years of my activities, they accused me in high treason and explained that I will not get out alive, I'll be sentenced to death if I will not say publicly that they're right and we're wrong.
Sentenced to 14 years, he served 9, largely for spreading truth about human rights abuses in the Soviet Union. Now, I understand when you were in prison that one of the things that strengthened you was the Book of Psalms.
My Hebrew was not good enough, and I was reading, comparing different words, sentences, and it so happened that the first sentence which I understood fully was Psalm 23, and when I go through the valley of death, fear no evil because you are with me.
Were you a believer in God before this?
There is no physical explanation why you're ready to sacrifice your life if you don't understand that there are things which are much bigger than your physical survival. When I understood that I'm released, when they took away all the prison clothes, gave me silk clothes, and brought me to the airplane, so I was lying in the snow, refusing to move until they'll bring me back my psalm book.
You still have it?
It's always with me, yeah.
No, that's it?
Yeah, that's it.
Sharansky and his wife Avital were married one day before his arrest. She then led the charge for his release.
They crossed the border and the airplane from Israel took me, and that's how I met, after 12 years, my wife, and that's how I met all our Jewish people. So the day which started in Soviet KGB prison finished near the Kotel with thousands of our friends celebrating my release.
His struggle played a major role in the fall of the Iron Curtain, which opened the door for 2 million Jews to leave the Soviet Union. Years later, Sharansky headed the Jewish Agency, the organization that brings new immigrants to Israel.
So it is really the history of Exodus repeated itself in modern history.
Yeah. Scott Ross for CBN in Jerusalem.
Still ahead, Ukrainian Jewish orphans sheltering in Israel move forward with their lives here, given the uncertainty back home. When more than 100 Jewish orphans and others fled war-torn Ukraine 6 months ago, they found a short-term home in Israel. The group is moving forward with their lives here for now, given the uncertainty back home. A rabbi and his wife led the orphans, other children, and staff out of Ukraine and found a safe landing outside Jerusalem. The sign behind me says Bruchim Habaim. That's welcome in Hebrew. And these Ukrainian refugees have certainly felt welcome here at Nes Harim for the last 6 months.
The half year we were here was the most wonderful half a year. We didn't know there was such a thing in the world, that they would receive us with such love.
People really opened their hearts and their arms to us and just did whatever they could to help us out. So that was really amazing. And we feel that. It was very, very, very heartwarming.
Rabbi Shlomo Wilhelm and his wife Esther led the Jewish community in Zhytomyr, Ukraine for 27 years before fleeing the war. Now their entourage is leaving Nes Harim for the Israeli coastal city of Ashkelon, where they'll stay for at least a year.
But it's very much a transition period, which means we always knew we wouldn't be able to stay here forever. So it was like we got used to life here, and now we have to get ready to go on.
There's no contradiction between good and bad. Everything good comes with difficulty. All of life is a challenge. All of life is about continuing to go forward. Everything new is like the peel of a seed. Before a tree starts to grow, the seed decays in the ground and then a new tree grows.
CBN News first met the group shortly after their arrival in Israel. It came during the Purim holiday, when Jews celebrate deliverance from evil, as told in the book of Esther. We've continued to follow them, such as when the kids' teacher from Ukraine made a surprise visit, and now for their farewell party. Gili Maimon manages the Nesharim Field School and became hero and friend to the children.
This was a very, very special project that Kakal did together with the Israelis. We will miss them and we wish them a lot of success on their new path.
Irina Kabakova says she has mixed emotions.
I feel, a bit sad, yes, because we are leaving, and happy, yes. I'm in a good mood. I'm here for my children. I hope they will have great future here.
Nesharim is a field school of Keren Kayemet LeYisrael, Jewish National Fund, also known as Kakal. It's normally a place where youth groups and others come to hike and enjoy nature.
Kakal is an organization of all the Jewish people. We say that every Jew here in the land and in the diaspora has a share in Kakal. Therefore, it was clear and natural that we would help the Jews in Ukraine.
CEO Ben Ami says Kakal also is helping Jews still in Ukraine with humanitarian aid.
It was our privilege to fulfill part of the goals, part of the aspirations of Kakal. It was exciting, it was humane, and it really emphasized how important Kakal is, not only for Israel, but for Jews around the world.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Nesharim, Israel. That's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And remember, the God who's watching over Israel, and you and me, never slumbers nor sleeps. I'm Julie Stahl. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.